Okay, hello, juniors. Welcome back to another day of APUS history online. So we're starting with our first official lesson today, which is going to be about the Great Depression. So you're going to listen to a lecture from me, take some notes on that lecture, and then I have an ACT reading practice that I want you to work on. Okay, so let's get started with this lecture. Before we start, I want to name that I kind of skipped World War One and jumped to the Great Depression. I'm going to combine World War One and World War Two together. I just feel like talking about World War One would be out of context, and I also think jumping into the Great Depression would be really important during this time when everything's going on, and you might be hearing some news or people feeling concerned that the Great Depression is going to happen again. So we're going to do that. Also, I'm coming to you from my couch this time. I decided to get a little more comfy because sitting in my little kitchen table chair trying to make lessons is not working for me. Okay, so here we go. So the Great Depression. I'm going to talk about the 1920s, but the dates you should know for the Great Depression is 1929 to 1941. And the Great Depression does not refer to people being really sad. I mean, they were. But it is an economic decline, like a recession. So the most recent recession that you were alive for was in 2008. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to keep going through this. Okay, so we're going to start in the 1920s. So World War II ends in 1918. No, I haven't talked about, World War I ends 1918. No, I haven't talked about it. That's okay. And then you see the rise in business again. So to kind of contextualize this, remember we had the Gilded Age, where you have a rise in factories, rise in industry, the railroad, all that stuff. Then you have the Progressive Era, which is trying to address inequality. World War I kind of takes away the Progressive Era. And then you have the rise in business again, mostly stemming from the automobile. So the president at this time, Calvin Coolidge, he was also, I think, vice president or in the secretary of something for the president before him. A famous quote that he says is, "The chief business of the American people is business." That's because business just rose again, and mainly because of the automobile. So Henry Ford, General Motors start to become really big people during this time. And there's rippling effects from the car being made, or the automobile, right? Like when you have cars, but to make a car, you need to have rubber, steel, oil. So there's a rise in all of those industries. And then there's also a rise in the development of roads, because you can't really drive a car if you don't have roads. You know what I mean? So you see a lot of ripple effects coming from one big industry. In the 1920s, you also see a big rise in consumerism. Remember, consumerism means the people buying different goods. So new inventions make people want to buy things. One, a car, but we also had the vacuum cleaner. You had the telephone, the refrigerator. You also have the development of movie theaters. So more and more people are going out to go see movies. And then a radio, where you can listen to the radio in your house. So a lot of different inventions is leading to people to buy more and more things. Just like today, sometimes people didn't have the money to buy what they wanted, so they would use credit. Not necessarily like a credit card, but you'd go to a store and say, "Hey, I'll pay you back," kind of thing like that. So people could buy things. So demand, or what everyone is buying, increases significantly during the 1920s. And this is important because this is a big reason why the U.S. goes into the Great Depression. Cool. I already mentioned this a little bit, but just to dig in a little further, the 1920s marks the end of the Progressive Era. So remember the Progressive Era, you have a rise in labor unions and their influence. You have the federal government actually passing regulations focusing on consumer protection, kind of trying to keep businesses in check. The 1920s would be a reversal of that. So Calvin Coolidge, this is the Supreme Court, start ruling and passing laws against labor unions, so they don't have as much power as businesses. They also wanted less government regulation for industry and businesses, and then less government like spending and intervention. So less taxes on people. The government shouldn't have too much money. The government shouldn't be involved. So the government takes a step back and decides, like, it is not our job to be in the economy. We should no longer be in the economy. We just need to let it do its own thing and see what happens. I mean, obviously we know what happens. Great Depression, but whatever. Okay. The 1920s is also pretty interesting in society. You have a lot of different things going on here. I'm going to move this little web camera so you can see some stuff. So flappers, some of you guys maybe have dressed up as a flapper for Halloween, who knows, but that's a term that was used for women sort of celebrating their independence. And again, to contextualize this a little bit, women gained the right to vote right at the start of 1920s. So there was this big belief that there was going to be like a movement towards women liberation and independence and all that stuff. In reality, that took quite a bit of time and another world war for, women to get more independence, if we're being real. You also see the kind of fear of socialism. So the U.S. is pretty like anti-socialist. I don't know, like Bernie Sanders, for some reason, everyone really freaks out about him. They call him a socialist. I don't think he is, but and a lot of that stems from 1917, when the Russia had a revolution and turned into the Soviet Union and the Communist Party. So socialism is against capitalism, where you don't have like the free market. So think about big business, the rise in industry, all these people making money. The last thing they want is not to have like open businesses and open markets. So if you were a socialist during this time, you were very much targeted. You weren't allowed to have like your personal political beliefs. And I would say like your freedom of speech was restricted. Over here, prohibition is also during this time, which meant that you could no longer buy alcohol or sell alcohol. So that definitely affected 1920s culture in that, people still drink because they want to. So you have like those like secret speakeasies or people making alcohol. You have like gangs trying to control the distribution of alcohol. So there's that influence with the 1920s. And the last is the Harlem Renaissance. So World War I, we already know there's segregation in the South, but World War I highlights the segregation that's happening in cities like New York City, where we would maybe be like, oh, they're progressive, they know what they're doing. I don't know, kind of thing. So World War I, you had a lot of Black Americans being recruited. They were divided from their peers, white soldiers fighting. They come back to New York City. They're not celebrated like the other soldiers. And in New York City in particular, you have a lot of Black Americans living in certain neighborhoods. And one of those is Harlem. In the 1920s, you have the Harlem Renaissance, which is this sort of celebration of these neighborhoods and what the art and everything that's come up because of segregation. And some famous like jazz musicians, you have some famous books like Their Eyes Were Watching God. All of it's coming out of the Harlem Renaissance to sort of celebrate this culture that was stemmed and perpetuated from U.S. segregation, especially in cities. Okay, so let's get to the meat of this. So the Great Depression. A lot of people say the Great Depression starts 1929 when there is a stock market crash. The stock market crash itself is not what causes the Great Depression. And in fact, today, everyone's talking about the stock market like every day. It's more just a sort of system to gauge the health of the economy. So if stocks are trading a lot, if things look good, in theory, the economy should be good. If things are not being traded, everyone's freaking out, then in theory, the economy is bad. So 1929, you have the stock market crash, and which is evidence that there was going to be a big, big problem in the U.S. economy. This problem starts from something called speculation. So this belief that because of high demand, that people are going to buy more things, buy more property, buy more houses, and therefore putting too high of a value on it when people are borrowing money and they actually can't pay that money back. So you lose sort of confidence once you start realizing like, oh, wait, no one can actually pay any of the money back for all these things that I've made. And now I'm in debt and I'm not going to get paid money for this. You also have some other things happening leading to the Great Depression. So Europe, getting over World War I, relied a lot on U.S. imports because U.S., there was no like fighting on our territory, right? So our economy was still good. You see the rise in different European economies. They don't need U.S. imports as much. And then this is a picture from Germany. So Germany had to pay a lot of money because they lost World War I. And to the point where they were like printing so much money it was worthless. So you see this, they're like burning money here. So essentially Germany wasn't paying any of the money it owed to countries, which means these other countries now don't have money, which just like perpetuates the lack of money coming from these places. Cool. And so this leads us to what is known as the Great Depression. So a quick little sort of like economics thing for you. Depression or recession means that unemployment is high and demand is low. So right now, there's a big concern and fear that we are in a recession or we are going to go into a very, very big recession. And there's for a lot of reasons. One, no one's can go to work. So people aren't out there like spending money. A lot of people have lost their jobs, which means that high rate of unemployment. And because we're all like being told to stay in our homes, we can't go out and spend money on things, even if the demand is there. Like you can't go see a movie or you can't go to a baseball game, stuff like that, right? And so less demand and less spending and high unemployment are indicators of what is a depression. And so just to kind of like explain these graphs a little bit, so I'm looking at my notes at the same time. So this is a supply and demand graph, and like the price. So supply goes up like this, demand is like this, right? In this graph in particular, if demand goes down, for example, a recession, or when you have the Great Depression and you have the rise in unemployment, the price goes down. So sort of everything falls apart. Like there's less supply, lower price, less demand. So you don't start to have like not even enough goods for people and the spending is low. This is also a graph of the unemployment rate during the Great Depression, which is pretty significantly high. I would say in today's world, they were saying that unemployment was probably about here in March or like at the beginning of March. And now they think unemployment's going to be about here, right? So pretty significant. And there are real implications to unemployment beyond just like, oh, you don't have a job, right? You can't spend money. In the Great Depression time, not necessarily our time, well, kind of, but not totally. So it takes me to the next slide is the Great Depression and Americans. I want to bring us back to this belief that was happening right before the Great Depression, which is that the government does not need to get involved in the economy. And this belief sort of carried over as far as the Depression goes, and the government doesn't need to get involved to help Americans necessarily. Like people are just going to have to pull themselves up from the bootstraps. Companies are going to have to help them, all that stuff. And there are some pretty like severe implications from this. So the first things first is a lot of people lost their homes. If you can't pay your mortgage, you can't pay for your home, you can't live there. So you see a rise in homelessness, and this resulted in a couple of things. First, this is an example down here, is something called Hoovervilles, where people are like making makeshift homes, which was like very significant during the Great Depression. And trying to live there with their families and trying to survive. You also see people moving out of cities. So instead of staying in like Chicago, moving west with this belief that there'd be more land, they could live there, they could farm for themselves to have enough food. There's a really good sort of like documentary or depiction of this seen here, where all of these families are moving out west, but at the end of the day, there just wasn't enough production and supply of food. There wasn't enough production and supply of goods for people, and there wasn't enough jobs. So people were kind of moving, hoping for the best, making makeshift camps wherever they can. You also see a lot of people without jobs, and this has real implications in sort of like people's view and positivity. A lot of men at this time, because, inequality, were working as opposed to women. And because they just sort of lost their jobs and their livelihoods, you saw this really massive increase in the suicide rate. And so initially the start of this was the government trying to like bring some positivity, like you got to keep going, you got to take care of your family, because there were some very severe emotional implications from a depression beyond just not having money, right? Like it is a pretty tough way to live. And because the government didn't really respond very well, at least not under the president during this time, you'll see what the government does later. I've kind of already alluded to it. People feel very much on their own, very isolated, very alone, very much like, how am I going to fix this issue for myself? And felt very responsible for the Great Depression, even though it clearly was not one singular person's issue. Cool. So the Great Depression happens in 1929. The president at that time is President Herbert Hoover. H squared is his name, after President Calvin Coolidge, C squared. Anyway, Herbert Hoover's, it kind of believed the same belief that, which he was a Republican, so that's where you see the shift in sort of parties, is that the the government should not be involved in the economy. They should not interfere too much. Capitalism and free markets is the way to go. So the initial response to the Great Depression was, economic depressions and downturns and recessions are a part of capitalism, which is fairly true, right? Like in economies, you have ebbs and flows. It kind of goes like a wave, right? And then you'll always sort of have a time where you're in a downturn. So the initial response was, it happens. Let's let the markets figure it out. Let's let the businesses figure it out. There wasn't a government intervention to help consumers or people losing their houses or people losing their jobs. Instead, what Herbert Hoover would do is kind of plea to volunteer. So like businesses like, hey, please just like keep paying your people, or please keep them employed, or grocery stores, please give out food to people, but not some sort of like mandate that it has to happen. And if you think about it, and I think it's similar to this time, a lot of people are suffering, a lot of people are struggling. Your internal instinct is not to give to people, right? Like you're trying to protect yourself, you're trying to make sure you're good. And these businesses and these stores aren't even making a profit anyway. So the sort of like volunteer response didn't really work. Nonetheless, he would say like, oh, there's a changing tide, everything's getting better. It would be like 1931, like, oh, things are going to be good, I promise y'all. And it was just kind of like a lie, a false like fabrication of that things are getting better, when really there's no evidence that's the case. So not only do you have people losing faith in the economy, you have people losing faith in the government and their response to things, and the feeling that they're going to like actually handle some stuff, right? So eventually he kind of shifts his tone and is like, okay, I got to do some stuff. And he passes the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is kind of similar to what you see the government doing today, like right now, where you're giving out like loans, you're giving out some sort of unemployment stuff, you're trying to pay money for infrastructure, so to build bridges, roads, anything that can get people jobs. But the response is like you can see in this political cartoon, it was a little bit too little, too late. And that's like the biggest issue that he runs into, is all of the sudden the government deciding to give out loans just didn't help because there was no one there to take loans. And remember, the Great Depression lasts for a long time. That slide says 1929 to 1941. So you're going to have to do a lot more than just give out some loans to people. Which brings me to the last slide of the lecture. I still have more to tell you. Is the Great Depression is still going on. You have the election of 1932, and you see the rise in Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, president. If you listen to my intro video, which I know all of you did, FDR and his policies during the Great Depression significantly changed the American view of the Great Depression and the government involvement in the economy. And I think like to give kind of like hopefully some encouragement, you got to be like realistic. But today, when everyone's very worried about the economy and everyone's really worried about the depression, it is totally 100% valid, right? But it is not 1929. Like the government and the view people have of the government is that it is the government's responsibility to make sure people are taken care of and to try to help people get out of a depression and to not just let people suffer and starve and be homeless, right? And so I think if there's anything to learn from history, which some of you may not believe that history, there's a point to it because, like, why are we learning it if we're not changing it? Partima looking at you. There are things to learn from the past. Like, you can clearly see that the lack of government response at the start of the Great Depression perpetuated the economic downturn. So I am hopeful, regardless of who's in charge of what, that history has shown the government responding to things does help. And so hopefully we'll see that happen. Okay, so that's the lecture. So you should have been taking Cornell notes. Don't forget to add those questions in there. I want at least 3 questions for what you're seeing. I want to show you the assignment, the reading assignment, sort of what I want from you. So let me go to that. Hope it's okay. I'm recording my face. I just feel like you should see me. I don't know, whatever. Okay, so this is just an ACT practice. You don't need the lecture necessarily to help you with this, but you will need the lecture for the next 2 lessons coming up. So if you don't have good notes for that, that's going to be a problem. So I'm grading the Cornell notes, and then I'm going to grade your reading practice. And the CFS for grading is here. So I'm just going to go through this to make sure we're like super duper crystal clear, because I really want y'all to get 100% on this. There is no reason why you can't. The only reason you won't is if you don't follow this. So the first thing is create an annotation focus for any and every relevant question, which are supporting detail questions. You should annotate using highlight or underline or etc. So obviously, when you're going through this, you know how to do this. You can highlight, you can underline. Okay, cool. Eliminate questions using strike through. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So let's say I want to eliminate this question. I go to Format, Text, and it says strike through, and it'll take it off. I want to see what questions you're eliminating. And this will be important when you start getting into the corrections of this. Okay, cool. Other parts of the CFS, entering questions, there's a Google form that's just going to score you automatically. Once you get that score, you're going to correct your wrong answers using the text and a comment. So for example, let's say you get number 1 wrong and that you find the answers here. You're going to highlight the answer and you're going to leave a comment on the side explaining why it's the correct answer. All of these things need to be done. It's only 7 questions. It's really not that big of a deal. So I need you to follow the CFS. I don't know if the Google form quiz tells you the right answer or not. So if someone could be like really cool and let me know. Even if it does tell you what the right answer is, I still want you to do the correction where you're finding the right answer in the text and using a comment. Okay, well, hope y'all had a good weekend. And I'll see you guys on Friday where we start talking about FDR and the New Deal. As always, feel free to reach out with questions, comments, concerns, chit-chat. I also have office hours on Wednesday. I'm recording this on Friday or Thursday, April 9th, so I feel a little disoriented. But on Wednesdays, which is when this is posted, or when you're supposed to do it in theory, I have office hours from 2:45 to 3:45, so you can go ahead and hop on in there, say hello, chit-chat, talk about your grade, talk about life, talk about this assignment, whatever you would like to do. Okay, I'm going to stop there.